300 Comanche warriors don't ride into a town at high noon unless they're declaring war or delivering justice. The people of Redemption Falls were about to find out which one it was. But this story doesn't start with warriors. It starts with fire and cowardice and a stable boy that nobody thought mattered, until he did. August 1869. Redemption Falls sat in the heart of Texas cattle country, a town that had grown fat on beef and arrogance. Population about 400. Give or take the drifters and ranch hands who came and went with the seasons. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business. And if you didn't fit the mold, you learned to keep your head down and your mouth shut. Marcus Webb knew that lesson better than most. At 15 years old, he worked as a stable boy for James Cutler, one of the bigger ranchers in the area. Marcus was Apache. His mother had been killed in a raid when he was 6. His father had disappeared, probably dead too. A traveling preacher found Marcus half-starved and brought him to Redemption Falls, where Cutler agreed to take him on as cheap labor. Cutler wasn't a bad man, wasn't particularly good either. He paid Marcus in food and a place to sleep in the barn loft, taught him to read a little, treated him better than most white folks treated Indians, which wasn't saying much. But Marcus worked hard, learned fast, had a way with horses that bordered on magical. The animals trusted him in a way they didn't trust anyone else. The other ranch hands tolerated Marcus because Cutler insisted on it. The town folks crossed the street when they saw him coming. The shopkeepers watched him like a hawk whenever he came in with Cutler's supply list. He was always one wrong move away from a beating or worse. Marcus understood the rules. Stay quiet. Stay useful. Stay invisible. Then came the day everything burned down. Literally. It started when 3 men rode into town. Brothers by the look of them. The Keller brothers, wanted in 2 territories for robbery and murder. They'd been running ahead of a posse and needed supplies, needed horses, needed money, and they weren't the type to ask nicely. They hit the bank first, killed the clerk who tried to resist, took everything in the safe, which wasn't much. Then they needed fresh horses because theirs were run into the ground. They went straight to Cutler's ranch, which sat just outside town proper. Biggest stable, best horses, easy target. Marcus was in the barn when they arrived. He heard the shouting before he saw them. Cutler's voice, angry and defiant. The Kellers laughing, then a gunshot. Marcus climbed up into the loft and peered through the slats. Cutler was on the ground, blood spreading across his shirt. Not dead yet, but getting there. His wife Sarah was screaming. The Kellers were loading horses, taking whatever they wanted. The oldest brother, a man with a scar bisecting his face, looked toward the barn and smiled. "Burn it," he said to his brothers. "Send a message that nobody refuses us." They didn't even check if anyone was inside, just threw torches into the hay. The dry straw caught immediately. Flames spread faster than Marcus thought possible. Within seconds, the entire first floor was an inferno. Marcus had maybe a minute before the loft became his coffin. He ran to the back of the loft, where a small window looked out over the rear paddock. No time to think, no time to plan. He jumped, 15 feet down, hit hard. Something in his ankle went wrong. Pain shot up his leg like lightning. But the barn was collapsing behind him, and pain didn't matter compared to being burned alive. Marcus crawled toward the fence line. Behind him, the barn exploded in a shower of sparks and burning timber. He heard horses screaming, heard the Kellers laughing as they rode away, heard Sarah Cutler sobbing over her dying husband. And Marcus heard something else. Silence from the town. Nobody coming to help. Nobody stopping the Kellers. Just silence and cowardice. Marcus made it to the tree line before he passed out from the pain. When he woke up, it was dark. His ankle was swollen to twice its normal size. The barn was just smoldering ruins. And from where he lay, Marcus could see into town. See people going about their evening like nothing had happened. Like James Cutler hadn't been murdered. Like his barn hadn't been burned. Like 3 outlaws hadn't just ridden through and destroyed everything. Nobody came looking for Marcus. Nobody cared if the Indian stable boy had burned to death or not. He was invisible, expendable, forgotten. Marcus lay there all night, pain radiating up his leg, watching the town ignore what had happened. And something changed inside him. Something hardened. He'd spent 9 years trying to fit into a world that didn't want him, trying to be useful enough that they'd let him survive. But usefulness didn't matter. To these people, he'd always be less than human, always be disposable. By morning, Marcus had made a decision. He started crawling, not toward town, away from it, east, toward the territories where his people still lived free, where being Apache wasn't a crime, where maybe, just maybe, he could find what was left of his father's tribe. The journey should have killed him. 3 days crawling and limping through rough country, with no food and no water. His ankle was infected. Fever made everything blurry and strange. But Marcus had inherited his people's stubbornness. He kept moving, kept pushing east, kept refusing to die. On the 4th day, scouts found him. Comanche, not Apache, but they were riding toward Apache territory for a meeting between tribes. They saw this half-dead boy, recognized the determination in his eyes, and made a choice. They picked him up, put him on a horse, took him with them. The Comanche brought Marcus to a gathering of tribes near the Brazos River. Apache, Comanche, Kiowa. Leaders from across the territory meeting to discuss the encroachment of white settlers, to plan strategy, to decide how to survive in a world that wanted them extinct. That's where Marcus met Chief Greyhawk of the Mescalero Apache, an old warrior with eyes that had seen everything and a reputation that made even other chiefs speak carefully. Greyhawk looked at this broken boy and asked him one question: "Who did this to you?" Marcus told him everything, about Cutler, about the Kellers, about the town that watched and did nothing, about being invisible his entire life. When he finished, Greyhawk was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that changed everything. "You are not invisible to me. You are not invisible to your people. And those who hurt you will learn that every action has consequences." Marcus spent the next 20 years with the Mescalero. Greyhawk adopted him formally, making Marcus his son in all but blood. The chief taught him to fight, taught him strategy, taught him patience, taught him that revenge is a dish best served cold, and justice sometimes takes decades to arrive. But it always arrives. Marcus's ankle healed wrong. He walked with a permanent limp, but that limp became his signature, a reminder of what had been done to him, a promise of what he'd do in return. He learned languages: English, Spanish, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa. He became a translator, a negotiator, a bridge between tribes that had been enemies for generations. And slowly, carefully, Marcus built something unprecedented: an alliance, not just between clans or bands, but between entire peoples, Apache and Comanche setting aside old feuds, because Marcus convinced them they faced a common enemy. By 1889, Marcus was 35 years old. Gray Hawk had died 2 years earlier, but not before naming Marcus as his successor. Not chief, the elders still weren't ready for that, but war leader. The man tribes called when they needed someone smart and dangerous. The man who'd united more warriors than anyone in living memory. And Marcus had never forgotten Redemption Falls, had never forgotten James Cutler, bleeding in the dirt, had never forgotten the silence of good people doing nothing. For 20 years, he'd been patient, building strength, gathering allies, waiting for the right moment. That moment came when scouts brought word that the Keller brothers were back, operating out of Redemption Falls like they owned the place. The town had grown, maybe 600 people now, prosperous, protected by a sheriff who looked the other way when the Kellers needed him to. The brothers ran everything: intimidation, protection rackets, murder when it suited them. Nobody stopped them. Nobody stood up to them, just like nobody had stopped them 20 years ago. Marcus called a council, representatives from the Mescalero Apache, the Comanche, the Kiowa. He told them the story again. Not for revenge, he said, for justice, for a lesson that needed teaching. 3 men burned a barn with a boy inside. A town watched and did nothing. That boy survived. That boy remembers. And that boy is offering you a chance to show the white world that we are not invisible. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will Gen Han everyone. The war leaders debated for 3 days. Some argued it was too risky, that attacking a town would bring the cavalry down on all of them. Others argued that's exactly why they should do it. Show strength. Show unity. Show that native people couldn't be ignored or dismissed anymore. In the end, 300 warriors volunteered. Mescalero, Comanche, Kiowa, men who'd fought each other in the past, now riding together, all because of Marcus, all because they believed in what he represented. A future where they didn't have to be invisible. They rode out on a Tuesday morning. 300 warriors in full regalia, war paint, feathers, the symbols of their peoples displayed proudly. They moved fast, covered ground quickly. By Wednesday evening, they were camped 10 miles from Redemption Falls. Marcus sent scouts ahead to confirm the Kellers were still there. They were. Thursday at noon, 300 warriors rode into Redemption Falls down the main street. The sound of that many horses moving together was like thunder. Every person in town stopped what they were doing and stared. Women grabbed their children. Men reached for guns they didn't have. The sheriff stepped out of his office and froze. Marcus rode at the front, Gray Hawk's war staff in his hand, his limp visible as he dismounted. Behind him, 300 warriors spread out in perfect formation, surrounding the town, not attacking, not threatening, just present, undeniable, impossible to ignore. Marcus walked toward the sheriff. The man was young, probably wasn't even living here 20 years ago. But he wore the badge. He represented the town's authority. "I'm looking for the Keller brothers," Marcus said in perfect English. His voice carried across the silent street. "I'm also looking for anyone who remembers James Cutler. Anyone who remembers his barn burning. Anyone who remembers doing nothing while a good man died." The sheriff's hand moved toward his gun. 300 bows drew back. 300 arrows pointed at him. He wisely moved his hand away. "Now wait just a minute," the sheriff started. No, Marcus cut him off. You wait. 20 years ago, 3 men rode into this town. They killed James Cutler. They burned his barn with me inside. I was 15 years old. I worked for Cutler. I slept in that barn. And when they set it on fire, not one person in this town tried to stop them. An older woman in the crowd gasped. She remembered. Others started murmuring. They remembered too. The Kellers are in the saloon, someone finally said. A shopkeeper Marcus didn't recognize. They're always in the saloon. Marcus turned to his warriors. 4 of you come with me. The rest stay here. If anyone interferes, you know what to do. He walked toward the saloon, his limp pronounced, each step deliberate. Behind him, 4 warriors followed. The rest maintained their positions around town. The message was clear. This wasn't a raid. This was justice being delivered with precision. Inside the saloon, the Keller brothers sat at a back table playing cards. They looked up when Marcus entered. Didn't recognize him at first. Why would they? He'd been a terrified boy. Now he was a man with an army at his back. I'm here about James Cutler, Marcus said, and a barn you burned 20 years ago. The oldest brother, the one with the scar, squinted at Marcus. Then recognition dawned. His face went pale. The Indian kid, the stable boy. You're supposed to be dead. Supposed to be. Marcus took another step forward, but I survived. Spent 20 years preparing for this moment. And now I'm giving you a choice. You can face justice here, in front of this town that protected you. Or you can face justice out there, in front of 300 warriors who want to make an example of you. The Kellers went for their guns. They were fast, professionals. But Marcus was faster. His knife was out and flying before they cleared leather. It took the oldest brother in the throat. The second brother got an arrow from one of Marcus's warriors. The third tried to run and got tackled by 2 warriors who'd come through the back door. The entire fight lasted maybe 10 seconds. When it was over, 2 Kellers were dead. The third was on his knees with a knife at his throat. Marcus walked over to him. This one was the youngest, the one who'd actually thrown the torch into the barn. Marcus remembered his face laughing in the firelight. You burned a barn with a boy inside, Marcus said quietly. You didn't check if anyone was there. You didn't care. We were all invisible to you. Indians, servants, people who didn't matter. The brother was crying now, begging, please. I was young. I didn't know better. You were 19, old enough to know murder, old enough to face consequences. Marcus nodded to his warriors. Take him outside. They dragged the last Keller into the street. The entire town watched as Marcus stood over him. 300 warriors waited for his signal. The town that had done nothing 20 years ago was being forced to watch justice delivered by the people they'd dismissed as savages. Marcus looked around at the faces, some guilty, some scared, some defiant. He saw Sarah Cutler in the crowd. She was older now, grayer, but she recognized him. Tears were streaming down her face. 20 years ago, Marcus said loudly enough for everyone to hear, this town let evil ride through and do whatever it wanted. You were too scared or too indifferent to stop it. A good man died because of your cowardice. Today, you're going to watch justice happen. And you're going to remember that Native people are not invisible. We are not disposable. And we do not forget. He turned to the Keller brother. You have one chance to live. Confess every crime you've committed in this town, every murder, every theft, every person you've hurt. Confess it all, and I'll let the law decide your fate. The brother talked for 20 minutes, confessed to 7 murders, dozens of thefts, extortion, assault. The list went on and on. The sheriff wrote it all down with shaking hands. The town listened in horror as they learned what they'd been harboring, what they'd been protecting through their silence. When the confession was complete, Marcus turned to the sheriff. Now you have a choice too. You can arrest this man and hold him for trial, or you can refuse, and I'll deliver justice right here in your street. What's it going to be? The sheriff arrested him. Had no choice, really. 300 witnesses, a full confession, and the knowledge that if he refused, the town would burn. Marcus and his warriors stayed for 3 hours, long enough to make their point, long enough for the town to understand that the world had changed, that native people had voices and power, and the ability to demand justice. Then they rode out the same way they'd come in, together, united, undeniable. News of what happened at Redemption Falls spread across the territories like wildfire. A native leader had ridden into a white town with an army and delivered justice without firing a shot. It was unprecedented. Newspapers couldn't decide if Marcus was a hero or a villain. The cavalry couldn't decide if they should hunt him or leave him alone. Tribal leaders couldn't believe he'd actually pulled it off. But Marcus didn't do it for fame or glory. He did it for a 15-year-old boy who'd been left to burn. He did it for James Cutler, who'd been killed while his town watched. He did it to prove that silence has consequences, and cowardice doesn't protect anyone. Sarah Cutler visited Marcus's camp 6 months later, brought him something wrapped in cloth. It was James Cutler's watch, the one the Kellers had stolen when they killed him. She'd bought it back from a pawn shop after their arrest. "He would have wanted you to have this," she said quietly. "James liked you, trusted you. I think he knew you were something special, even when you were just a stable boy." Marcus took the watch, held it carefully. "Thank you for remembering he mattered. Thank you for making sure nobody forgets." Sarah looked at the warriors working around camp. "You did something impossible. You made them see us as human beings. All of us. Not just native people. All of us who'd been invisible." The last Keller brother was tried and hanged for his crimes. The sheriff resigned in disgrace. Redemption Falls got new leadership that actually tried to serve justice. And slowly, carefully, the town began to change. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough that when native people came to trade, they weren't automatically treated like criminals. Enough that children grew up hearing the story of Marcus and his 300 warriors as a cautionary tale about justice delayed, but never denied. Marcus lived to be 56, died peacefully surrounded by family from multiple tribes. His legacy wasn't measured in battles won or enemies killed. It was measured in bridges built, treaties negotiated, lives saved through diplomacy instead of warfare. He became one of the most effective native advocates of his generation, all because he'd learned that true strength isn't about violence. It's about refusing to be invisible. They buried him on a hill overlooking the Brazos River, where Greyhawk had first found him dying and gave him a second chance at life. On his grave marker, they carved words in 3 languages: Apache, Comanche, English. They all said the same thing. He was invisible once. He made sure no one ever would be again. And every year, warriors from the tribes Marcus had united would gather at that grave. They'd tell the story to their children, about the stable boy who survived fire, about the man who built an army from old enemies. About the day, 300 warriors rode into a town not for war, but for something more powerful, for recognition, for justice, for the simple acknowledgement that every life matters, regardless of the color of skin or the language spoken. If you love this incredible story of justice from the Old West, smash that subscribe button right now. We've got dozens more tales about courage, redemption, and people who refuse to be forgotten. Click the video on your screen for another story that'll show you what real strength looks like.